There is a sound you already know before this sentence ends. A rapid riffle of comic pages, a brass sting, and a red block sliding across the screen. It happens in a movie theater, and 4,000 people settle into their seats like a congregation. By the time the logo resolves, the audience has already decided to trust whatever comes next. That is not a special effect. That is 30 years of borrowed faith cashing itself in, and most of the people feeling it have no idea what it cost to build. Marvel is, on paper, the most valuable storytelling engine ever assembled. More than 30 films. Tens of billions of dollars at the global box office. Characters so embedded in the culture that children who cannot yet read can draw the helmet. It is the rare brand that people tattoo onto their own skin. When we talk about Marvel, we talk about it the way we talk about weather or gravity, as though it were simply a fact of the world, permanent and self-evidently strong. That is the romance. And like every romance in these stories, it is a cover for something much stranger underneath. Here's the fact that breaks the myth in one line. In December of 1996, Marvel filed for bankruptcy. Not a rough quarter, not a restructuring. Chapter 11. The company that owns Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Avengers, the entire imaginative universe that now prints money on demand, stood in a Delaware courtroom and admitted it could not pay what it owed. The gods were on the books at a value of roughly nothing. Sit with how insane that is. The intellectual property alone, the raw characters, would later underwrite one of the most profitable runs any studio has ever had. In 1996, that same catalog could not keep the lights on. The value was all there, fully formed, sitting in a vault. The company simply had no way to turn it into cash, and the ways it had tried had nearly destroyed it. To understand Marvel, you do not start with the triumph. You start with the hole in the ground it climbed out of, because everything smart about Marvel is a reaction to almost dying. So how does a company sitting on the most beloved characters in America go broke? The answer is a lesson that has nothing to do with superheroes and everything to do with money, and it starts with a man who never read the comics. For most of its life, Marvel was a comic book publisher, and comic book publishing is a small, unglamorous business. You print paper, you ship it to newsstands and specialty shops, you take a modest margin, you do it again next month. It is a business that rewards patience and punishes anyone who mistakes it for something bigger. For decades, that is what Marvel was. Then, at the end of the 1980s, a financier named Ronald Perlman bought it. He did not buy it because he loved the stories. He bought it because it was a cash-generating asset he could load with debt, dress up, and flip. This is the thing nobody counts when they picture the origin. The real cost of entry into Marvel's world was not the cost of drawing a comic. It was the cost of the debt strapped to the company by owners who saw it as a financial instrument. Perlman took Marvel public and used it like a machine for issuing bonds. Money flowed out to the owners. Obligations piled onto the company. And to keep feeding the machine, Marvel had to keep growing its comic sales at a speed that no healthy comic business could ever sustain. So it manufactured a boom. In the early 90s, comics stopped being stories you read and became commodities you hoarded. Variant covers, foil covers, #1 issues bagged and boarded and bought in stacks of 10 by people who had never opened one, convinced these were the baseball cards of the future. For a brief window, it worked. Sales exploded. Everyone told themselves the demand was real. It was not real. It was speculation, and speculation always ends the same way. When buyers finally realized that a comic printed in the millions would never be rare, the entire market collapsed almost overnight. The people who had bought stacks of them stopped. The specialty shops that had over-ordered went under by the thousands. And Marvel, which had built its whole growth story on that fake demand, and had a mountain of debt that only made sense if the fake demand continued, went into freefall with nothing to catch it. And then, with the company already bleeding, the owners went to war over the corpse. This is the part that reads like a heist. As Marvel slid toward bankruptcy, Perlman tried to keep control by pushing a rescue plan that would have handed him more of the company while wiping out the bondholders. The bondholders had a champion of their own, the corporate raider Carl Icahn, who scooped up Marvel's distressed debt for cents on the dollar and moved to seize the whole company for himself. For the better part of 2 years, the people fighting over Marvel were not storytellers or fans. They were billionaires using the bankruptcy courts as a weapon, each trying to end up holding the characters when the music stopped. The heroes on the page were saving the world every month. The men who owned them were trying to take it from each other. Understand what bankruptcy actually meant inside those walls because the word is too clean for the reality. It meant creditors circling assets. It meant the company's future being decided by lawyers who cared nothing for the stories, in filings measured by the pound and bataman. It meant that at the lowest point, there were serious conversations about carving Marvel up and selling it for parts, letting the characters scatter to whoever would pay for a fragment. The single most valuable imaginative catalog in America came within a courtroom decision of being dismantled and auctioned. Not because the ideas had failed, but because the finance strapped on top of them had. The heroes did not lose. The balance sheet did, and it very nearly took the heroes down with it. While the financiers fought at the top, a quieter power was rising from an unlikely place. Marvel realized far too late that it had been in the wrong business the whole time. The money was never really in the paper. The money was in the characters. A comic sells for a few dollars once. A character, licensed correctly, can sell toys and lunchboxes and bed sheets and film tickets and theme park rides forever, in every country, in every language, for generations. The publisher had been sitting on an oil field and selling teaspoons of it at the newsstand. So, Marvel started leasing the oil field. It licensed its characters to anyone who would pay. And the single most important move in that whole scramble was a merger almost nobody remembers, with a toy company called ToyBiz. That deal is how two men who were not financiers ended up in control of Marvel as it came out of bankruptcy. One was Isaac Perlmutter, a fiercely frugal operator who counted paper clips and treated every dollar as though it were the last one in the building. The other was Avi Arad, a toy designer who genuinely believed these characters belonged on cinema screens. The money men had spent themselves out. The toy men were left holding the company, and they planted an idea that would eventually save everything. If a character on a lunchbox is worth this much, what is that same character worth on a cinema screen seen by 100 million people at once? Because that was the great unrealized asset, film. And in the beginning, film was where Marvel made its most short-sighted, most understandable, and most nearly fatal decision. Coming out of bankruptcy, Marvel was still fragile and still starved for cash. And Hollywood was interested in the characters, but Hollywood is expensive and slow, and Marvel could not afford to make movies itself. So it did the obvious thing. It sold the film rights to its biggest heroes to the studios that could afford them. The rights to Spider-Man, its single most valuable character, went to Sony. The rights to the X-Men and the Fantastic Four entire teams went to Fox. The rights to the Hulk drifted to Universal. Marvel took the checks and the small slice of the profits, and it kept the lights on. Every one of those deals made perfect sense on the day it was signed. Every one of them was money now for a company that was drowning. And every one of them carved a permanent hole out of the thing Marvel would later become. Because when Marvel finally decided to build its own cinematic universe, it would look at its own roster and find that its most famous faces had been leased out and were not coming home. The trap was not a mistake made by fools. It was the price of survival, and it shaped everything that followed. Then something happened that turned the knife. The studios that had leased Marvel's characters started making enormous amounts of money with them. Fox's first X-Men film was a hit. Sony's first Spider-Man film was a phenomenon, one of the biggest openings anyone had ever seen, hundreds of millions of dollars flooding in. And Marvel, the company that had dreamed up every one of those characters, watched the fortune arrive on someone else's balance sheet. For a licensing fee, Marvel had handed away the very thing the whole world now wanted, and it was standing outside the theater counting pennies while others counted the gate. So here's Marvel in the mid-2000s. It has clawed out of bankruptcy. It is earning steady, unglamorous licensing fees while other studios make the actual movies and keep the lion's share. It has sold off its crown jewels to stay alive and then watch those crown jewels make other people rich. And a handful of people inside the company look at that arrangement and reach a conclusion that sounds, at the time, completely deranged. They decide that Marvel is being paid pennies to hand strangers the keys to a fortune. Sony makes a Spider-Man film and earns hundreds of millions. Marvel gets a licensing fee that would not cover the catering. The people who own the characters are earning the least from them. And the only way to fix that is to stop licensing and start producing. To make Marvel's own films, keep the upside, and finally turn the vault into an empire. There was one enormous problem. Making films cost a staggering amount of money, and Marvel did not have it. This is a company that had recently been bankrupt. No bank hands that company hundreds of millions of dollars to gamble on an untested idea. And the characters investors would have wanted as collateral The Spider-Mans and the X-Men were already gone, out on lease to other studios. So, Marvel did the boldest, strangest thing in this entire story. It went to Wall Street, to Merrill Lynch, and it borrowed a credit line of hundreds of millions of dollars. And as collateral, it put up the only thing it had left. The characters nobody else had wanted. Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, Black Widow, Hawkeye, Ant-Man, the second string. The names that, at the time, meant almost nothing to the general public. Read the terms of that deal and your stomach drops because Marvel effectively mortgaged its own children. The agreement said, in plain financial language, that if these films failed, the lender could take the characters. If the bet went wrong, Marvel would lose the film rights to Iron Man, to Captain America, to Thor. The company would be left as a publisher with no path back to the screen, having handed its last valuable assets to a bank. There was no soft landing written into it. It was the whole company on a single number. And they staked all of it on Iron Man, a B-list character. A rich alcoholic in a metal suit, led by an actor whose reputation, at the time, made him almost uninsurable. Robert Downey Jr. had spent years in and out of trouble, and the studio was warned, repeatedly, that no one would insure a film built around him. The safe choice was to cast someone bankable and forgettable. Marvel, against the advice of nearly everyone with money at stake, cast the risk. It let the actor improvise, it built the character around his voice, and it gambled that charm would carry a property most of the audience had never heard of. Every conventional read of that decision said it was madness. The safe characters were leased out. The star was a risk. The studio was a former bankrupt. The money was borrowed against the characters themselves. If the film opened soft, the dominoes were already lined up to fall. And they filmed much of it without a finished script, chasing a tone rather than a blueprint, on a bet that the feeling was the product. This is the real revenue mechanism of Marvel, and it is worth saying slowly because it is the opposite of what the polished logo suggests. Marvel did not win because it had the best characters. For years, its best characters belonged to other people. Marvel won because, at the exact moment, it had the least to lose and the most to gain. It stopped renting out its imagination and bet the entire company on owning the result. The genius was not creative. The genius was refusing, finally, to be the one who gets paid least for the thing everyone else is getting rich on. Iron Man opened. It worked. And it worked so completely that Marvel did something no one had really done before. In a scene tucked after the credits, a man in an eye patch walked into frame and spoke about a larger world, a team, an initiative. It was a promise delivered to an audience that did not yet know it wanted one, that this was not a film but the first floor of a building. And the moment that promise landed, the whole terrifying structure inverted. The borrowed money became a foundation. The second-string characters became the core of a shared universe that could compound on itself, film after film, each one selling the next. The thing that would have destroyed the company became the thing that made it unassailable. And within a year of proving the model, Marvel was no longer a wounded survivor. It was the most desirable asset in entertainment. And here's where the mechanism showed its real teeth, because a single hit is luck, but a system is a fortune. Marvel did not simply make another film. It made several, each starring a different one of those pawned second-string characters, and it engineered every one of them to point at the same horizon. A god of thunder. A soldier out of time. A man in a metal suit. Each film stood alone and sold a ticket, and each film quietly deposited a character into a shared account that was building toward a single withdrawal. When that team-up finally arrived, when the separate threads were pulled into one enormous film, the audience had been trained for years to want exactly that moment. And they rewarded it with one of the largest box office results the world had ever recorded. The characters nobody had wanted, assembled together, out-earned the crown jewels Marvel had been forced to sell. The lesson compounded into law. Own the pieces, and the connections between them become worth more than the pieces themselves. Which brings us to the trap that never fully closed, and still shapes every film you watch. Because even at the height of the triumph, Marvel could not simply reach out and take back everything it owned. Spider-Man was at Sony. The X-Men and the Fantastic Four were at Fox. Those rights, sold in the desperate years, did not expire because the seller got successful. For a long time, Marvel had to build a universe with a hole in the middle of it, telling stories about a world that mysteriously contained no mutants and no wall crawler. Because the characters lived in other companies' vaults, That is the structural trap of leasing your best assets to survive. You do survive, and then you spend years, sometimes decades, and eventually billions of dollars trying to buy back the pieces of yourself you sold when you were poor. The Fox characters only came home when an entire film studio was purchased, a deal so vast that reclaiming the X-Men was almost a side effect of it. The Spider-Man situation had to be negotiated into an awkward, careful sharing arrangement that could collapse with a single failed meeting, and at one point very nearly did. The decisions that saved Marvel in its weakest hour became the permanent constraints of its strongest one. Nothing in this story is free. The bill always arrives just later and larger. So let us run the two versions of this story, because the distance between them is a single opening weekend. In the version that fails, the Iron Man bet goes wrong. The film opens soft, the audience shrugs, the risky star is blamed exactly as the insurers warned. Toffs. The Merrill Lynch credit line calls its collateral. Marvel loses the film rights to its last valuable characters, the way it had already lost Spider-Man and the X-Men, only this time to a bank rather than a studio. The company shrinks back into what it had always been, a publisher of paper in a declining market, its imagination scattered across other people's balance sheets. Disney never comes calling because there is nothing left worth $4 billion. The logo still riffles its pages before movies. They are just movies made by other people about characters Marvel used to own. In the version that works, the version we actually got, the bet lands, the universe compounds, and in 2009, Disney buys the whole thing for roughly $4 billion. A company that had been bankrupt 13 years earlier, that had been valued at essentially nothing, that had survived by pawning its heroes, sold for a sum that made its darkest hour look like a rounding error. The frugal toy man and the dreamer who believed in the movies had taken a company the financiers had left for dead and turned it into the most valuable prize in Hollywood. And the studios holding Spider-Man and the X-Men, who had bought scraps from Marvel in the desperate years, suddenly found that the second-string company they had picked over had become the center of the entire industry. Here's what the logo does not tell you. Marvel is not a story about the power of great characters, because for the crucial years, its greatest characters were owned by strangers. It is a story about ownership, about the difference between renting out your imagination for a safe fee and betting everything to keep the upside, about how the same asset can be worth nothing and worth billions depending only on who controls it and how brave or how desperate they are willing to be. The next time that red block slides across the screen and you feel the audience lean in, remember what is actually flickering there. Not a superhero. A company that went broke, sold its gods to eat, borrowed against the ones nobody wanted, and won a bet so large that losing it would have ended everything.